We're now joined by Laurel Miller, the director of International Crisis Group's Asia program. Thanks for joining us on this day of France 24's special coverage of Afghan women under the Taliban. Now, Afghanistan is largely dependent on foreign aid, and the International Crisis Group has written that many traditional donors are expected to link any future aid to the Taliban's treatment of the population, especially women. Could this be a factor that pushes the Taliban to moderate its stance towards women?
Well, it's certainly already a factor moderating their rhetoric about how they're going to treat women. We've heard Taliban leaders trying to convey a more moderate message towards women's role in society as compared to how they ruled in the 1990s when women were allowed no space in the public sphere and in education. But how this translates into actual policies of a government that hasn't even been formed yet, much less how it's going to be implemented on the ground, there are far more questions than answers about that.
And it's analysts of the International Crisis Group have said that certain military commanders within the Taliban who are more conservative could push back against those moderates within the group. Can you tell us more about these internal divisions in the Taliban and how that could affect women in Afghanistan?
I mean, there are a number of things that the Taliban leaders are going to have to balance. On the one hand, they're going to have to balance what it will take to be accepted as a legitimate government that receives financial support as Afghanistan has long needed. On the other hand, they have to balance what the beliefs, the views, the pressures are within the movement, and particularly among those who brought them to power, which is their fighters and commanders. And that latter group is not going to be particularly interested in what the international community thinks about the status of women. And then also much of Afghanistan, particularly the Taliban heartland in the Pashtun tribal areas of Afghanistan, is a conservative rural society where many women have seen really no changes over the last 20 years. And so there's also a kind of social, cultural pressures and realities that have to be borne in mind as all of these things are balanced.
Now, the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, estimates that more than 500,000 people have been internally displaced in Afghanistan this year alone, and that 80% of those internally displaced people are women and children. How can we expect the new Taliban leadership to respond to that crisis?
I think there's a good probability that they will be accommodating of international organizations, international UN agencies, and also nonprofit, non-governmental organizations that want to provide and will try to provide humanitarian assistance to the Afghan population and refugees. I think the Taliban leadership recognizes that that kind of support is needed, and it's in their benefit to essentially co-opt that support by allowing it to happen and take credit for that humanitarian assistance. But there's a big difference between the flow of humanitarian assistance to relieve urgent needs and development assistance and other forms of economic support that are needed for Afghanistan to advance from where it is now. And I don't see a lot of that forthcoming anytime soon.
All right, Laurel Miller, the director of International Crisis Group's Asia program, thank you so much for joining us here on the program.